Welcome to another SPJ International Community Talk on issues related to global press freedom. Thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Taylor, now blessedly retired, but for many years a Washington correspondent for ABC News, television and radio, Fox News, and other broadcast organizations. For 10 of those years, I was a White House correspondent. Today, I'm in Reston, Virginia, just outside of Washington. While people are joining us, there are a few housekeeping items. Please let us know where you are using the chat box. If along the way you have a question, please use the Q&A function. I will try to work in your question as the conversation progresses. We want to keep the chat box for Dan Kubisky, the co-chair of the SPJ International Community, to post links and other information as the conversation goes on. For example, you should be seeing the URL for the International Community website, where you can sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter and updates on future programs. This program is being recorded. After we're done, the recording will be posted on the International Community's YouTube channel. You should be seeing the URL for that site. There you will see, on the channel, you'll see talks and interviews going back more than 3 years with journalists and experts from around the world discussing press freedom and threats to journalists. Now this program. The domestic situation in Israel is in the news recently because of changes Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has proposed in the structure of the Israeli judiciary. Critics accuse Netanyahu of undermining judicial independence and Israel's democracy. Our guest, Ruth Margalit, has covered the Israeli political scene with an emphasis on the impact Netanyahu policies have had on the democratic institutions in Israel. She has also kept an eye on how Netanyahu's obsession with the freewheeling press in Israel has led to a real danger to press freedom in that country. Ruth is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. Her work also has appeared in the New Yorker, the Columbia Journalism Review, Slate, and others. She lives in Tel Aviv. Dan has posted a link to her website. Ruth, thank you for joining us. Before we get into the topic of the Israeli media landscape, could you give us a brief explanation of what drove you to become a journalist?
Oh, wow. Hi, Steve. It's good to be with you. What drove me to become a journalist? I've always loved writing, and I've been reading newspapers really since I can remember. They've always been around our house. And I also remember the kind of allure and mystique of the magazines from America that would come in, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books. And I love the kind of the long form essays and the investigative work that kind of combined, beautiful language and scenery with deep reporting. And that's when I kind of had the seed that that's what I would actually love to do, kind of combine the writing and the reporting. And I started working in Haaretz newspaper in Israel, and then went to New York, went to journalism school, and then started working at the New Yorker and sort of freelancing from there. And that's how I got started.
Where did you go to journalism school?
Columbia.
At Columbia. And did I just hear you say that straight out of college you went to work for the New Yorker?
Well, straight out of college, it's a master's program, and I was slightly older because I had been, I went to the army in Israel, and I had some years on other students. But yeah, I guess you could say that after college, I went to work for the New Yorker. That's right.
Benjamin Netanyahu. First of all, as I mentioned, I was a White House correspondent for a long time, and I did not really have many opportunities on a one-to-one basis to talk to any of the three presidents I covered. How much time do you spend with the prime minister?
Well, virtually none. I mean, he's very good about, flying the Israeli press around when he's on White House tours or, foreign expeditions. But usually these are off-the-record conversations. And it's quite interesting, even now, with everything that's going on and the protest movement and the sort of criticism about his recent actions, he's really shied away from giving interviews to Israeli journalists. And instead, what he tends to do is go to foreign outlets. So he's been on CNN, I believe he's been on, NBC. He loves the American media. He spent a lot of time in America growing up and still has that, it holds a special place for him. And so while he shuns Israeli media, most of the Israeli journalists, he does give these interviews abroad, which is quite interesting. The recent development is that he recently gave an interview here in Israel to a sort of, it's not exactly a new outlet, but it's kind of a revamped outlet that is really, that kind of, some see it as a mouthpiece for him. It used to be called a heritage channel. So it was in charge of kind of Jewish content and promoting Jewish programs and things like that. But it has really veered in part because he, as prime minister and as a communications minister, we should talk about that as well, how he used to hold both hats. He allowed this channel to start broadcasting news, and now it's doing very well. In fact, it's climbing the ratings, the ratings ladder, competing with other serious channels. And he does give these interviews to journalists there who are, obviously quite favorable of him, and give these sort of softball questions.
My experience in the Reagan, first Bush and Clinton administrations, in many cases, almost point for point, was the description you just made, particularly going to the people he doesn't see every day, thinking that he would escape reading the president's mind, but I'm arrogant enough to do that, and seeming like he was eager to escape. And most of the time I thought the presidents I covered were not successful in getting away from the questions they didn't want by going elsewhere. How well does it work out for the prime minister?
I agree with you. I tend to think that it doesn't, it doesn't come across very good when you're kind of fighting for local public opinion, and yet you go these sort of roundabout ways and you don't talk to the Israeli public. And when you do, it doesn't sound very authentic. But what he has been able to do, his way of kind of circumventing that recently, in recent years, is through social media. His Facebook presence is very strong. He has a lot of young adults kind of working the social media circuit for him. His son is very much involved. Yair Netanyahu is kind of this presence on the social media site. So he sort of found a way to do away with journalists and instead just broadcast what he would like.
Do you think that works? What I mean is, in social media, he is a man who is of an age where he is not necessarily a social media person. Right. He's used to print and broadcast, and so does that work out for him? He's mainly what concerns me. Doesn't concern me. If I were a reporter under those circumstances, I would say he's not controlling what goes out on social media as carefully as he does in press releases and interviews with newspapers. Is that the case? And if so, can you take advantage of that?
I think that's fair. I think that's a fair assessment, especially just this week. A journalist friend of mine actually broke the news that he and his wife, Netanyahu, and his wife, Sarah, told their son, Yair, to stop tweeting. So that in a sense, it's kind of creating a backlash for them because he's seen as sort of going off, pushing back against any criticism against his father, blaming the protesters, comparing them to, anything from kind of Nazis to, he's been a bit sort of unleashed, Yair Netanyahu. And for Netanyahu himself, given all the criticism and, people rightly going against the judicial overhaul that he's now launched, you can say what you will. He is intelligent. He's articulate. He used to hold he used to hold his ministers in check. And so whenever they spoke out or said something that was seen as sort of crossing a red line, he would always rein them in. And recently, you see that he's kind of lost control, both over his son and over the ministers in his government, and people are kind of taking their own agenda and their own line. And that's an interesting thing. And I think, in part, it's influenced by social media. He doesn't have this sort of leash on them anymore.
I think it's worth mentioning that the relationship between the prime minister and the ministers of his government is not the same as it is in the United States, because they are all members of the Knesset, are they not?
That's
His
right.
ministers. So it's more of the British system, and
Yes,
and they don't see themselves necessarily as working for him, working with him. Maybe is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, his ministers, some of them are from his own party, Likud party, but some are coalition partners that he needed to assemble in order to gain a majority in the Knesset, in parliament. And so many of them come from smaller parties, from ultra-Orthodox parties, from even, far right parties, further even to his right. And they have their own interests and they have their own sectors and voter base to appeal to and to ultimately win over. And so oftentimes those interests don't align and they want to be seen as being kind of harsh on the prime minister or as taking a more extreme line.
In the United States, the Secretary of State went on the New York Times and criticized the president in specific terms. He'd be fired. But that such criticism would be seen as more or less ordinary in Israel. Is that a good conclusion?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it also kind of leads into our discussion about the media and the press, because we'll talk about, intervention in the press and what it means for press freedom and how that's been sort of damaged over the years. But it's important to note that the press in Israel is very free in the sense, it's critical, it's incisive, it's investigative, it goes after those in power. So, just as you said about the ministers, that they're able to go and kind of, make these criticisms, the same is true about journalists. The problem is that there's this threat that this kind of freedom and this power is being imperiled, and that something here is being threatened right now.
Imperiled by Netanyahu's actions, you mean?
Yes, that's right. And by this, I mean, so he was voted into office for another term in November, and right after the swearing in of the government in January, his justice minister announced this new judicial overhaul. And what it basically means is more control for the executive and let fewer checks and balances in the country. In fact, it really means doing away with any checks and balance in the country, because the only real check and balance in Israel is the Supreme Court. And this judicial reform, what he calls a reform, would substantially weaken the power of the Supreme Court and give the government veto over Supreme Court decisions, and also a possibility to override Supreme Court decisions. And so once you have all this control, once he and his government will have all this control, it also bleeds into other fields, and that includes the media, that includes press freedom. And so that's the real worry.
You mentioned the communications minister was fired. Did you say that?
Well, no, so Netanyahu himself, it's funny, 10 years ago, when he was voted in 2009, he was voted to become prime minister for a second time. And since then, he has figured out that the one ministry he should keep to himself is the communications ministry. And that, I think, says a lot about where his heart lies. Some journalists in Israel really call it an obsession of his with the media. So he himself has in fact governed as the communications minister for many of those years. And while he was the communications minister, he also made some deals or allowed some regulation to happen that is now at the very heart of his corruption trial. And so in fact, the cases against him in his corruption trial are at the very, at their heart, they're about the media and his attempts to control the media.
When the news reports and yourself talk about the possibility of undermining judicial independence and Israeli's democracy, now there is, you can hear that sort of language in the United States at times. What specifically is the fear there? What could he do legally that would be unprecedented and seriously dangerous, in your opinion?
Right. So there is something called the Committee to Appoint Judges, which sounds sort of technical, banal, gray. But really what it means is that he wants the government to be able to control this committee and to appoint judges. Now, in the United States, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but in Israel, the government already controls parliament, so it controls the legislative branch. And now the worry is that it will also control the judiciary. And once it controls both the legislative branch, because it has a majority in parliament, and the judiciary, because it will be able to appoint judges and veto Supreme Court decisions, then it means that the government, the majority, those in power, can really, do as they like. And and when you ask them, they give all these bureaucratic reasons for why this needs to happen, but there's no one who can answer the question of what will happen if the government decides tomorrow to, let's say, extend Netanyahu's rule to 10 years, or to delegitimize Arab parties from running in Knesset. What will happen if the government tries to pass a law that is fundamentally anti-democratic? Who can veto that? Who can tell them that that's a red line? And the answer is, according to this reform, what they're trying to pass, there will be no one. There will be no red line. Netanyahu and his ministers keep saying, "Oh, we won't do that. You should trust us." But of course, we all know that democracies don't go. Trust isn't the order of the day, and there should be, a redress for minorities, and minority rights are really being hampered here.
One other specific: does he have the power to fire seated judges?
He himself doesn't have the power to do that, but if they change the judicial sort of makeup of the country, then the idea is that the government, yes, will be able to both veto future judges and to unseat, governing ones.
Change the makeup. It's the process of doing that I'm wondering about. If there's a seated judge who consistently opposes him, can that judge be taken out of office just on the word of the prime minister?
That's the concern. It won't be as direct as that. It will obviously go through the government and, his ministers who will be part of this committee to appoint judges. He will have people sitting on that committee who will do this, as you say. But right now, there is real concern for the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the woman Esther Chayut, who has spoken out against this judicial overhaul. And the concern is that she might get fired if these rules change. And of course, we shouldn't forget that Netanyahu himself is standing on trial too. And so his own personal interest, is deeply, deeply affected by who sits on the court and who could be future judges on this court once his case, sort of proceeds. And that's a real concern, because up until now, he's been shy about making, some of his ministers had proposed these judicial reforms in the past, but it's always been a step too far from him. He has always kind of stopped before taking these measures. And now with him actually being on trial, and the trial is ongoing while we speak in Jerusalem these days, he's suddenly taking up these really drastic measures to change the makeup of the judiciary. And I think, it's no coincidence.
How could he stop the trial?
Well, what he can do is appoint, so there are all these legal maneuvers. One maneuver is to appoint a kind of outside prosecutor to examine the case, someone who will say, stop, this needs to be kind of independently assessed. And the idea is that then it will be dragged out by this outside person. And the other reason, the other way this could happen, people say, is that, if the committee to appoint judges changes the future makeup of the Supreme Court, then the judges who will give him his verdict in a few years' time when it's ready might be very different from those who stand there today.
So he's not trying to stop the proceeding. He's just taking any weapon he can come up with to influence it.
to influence the outcome. That's right. But it could also stop. I mean, some people see it as perhaps stopping through these maneuvers of kind of appointing outside prosecutors, outside, sort of taking it out of the hands of the courts and into the hands of who knows what entity. But these are all conjectures, I should say. We don't know yet.
How have new news outlets in Israel, some of them politically biased, I understand, how have this affected the public's trust, not in Netanyahu, but in the media?
Well, public trust in the media right now is at its lowest. A recent poll had it at 23%. That's very, very low. This in the country where the media used to rank very high. But it's not only the media, I should say. Other democratic institutions have taken a hit. The public's trust in anything from the parliament to the court system to the media, everything is at its lowest that it's ever been. And in part, it has to do, I think, with this segmentation that we started talking about, with the news outlets coming in that are politically biased. And so you start getting a really fragmentation of the media market that didn't exist in Israel before. This is relatively new.
The public opinion about the news media and the public opinion about the prime minister, how do they stack up one against the other? Who's doing better?
Well, I think
maybe the better question would be who's doing worse.
I think that's a good question. From numbers I've seen so far, perhaps the prime minister is doing slightly better, but the recent measures he's taken with the judicial overhaul, they're really he's taken a hit with that. And so the polls now, we're 3 months after the election, 4 months after the election, in which he won decisively, and suddenly the polls show him, if elections were held today, his right-wing bloc is nowhere near a majority. And so that's a real change in just a very brief, period of time.
But there's no alternative, or is there an alternative in sight that is better respected? I mean, both on the political side, mainly on the political side. Does he have any opponents?
Well, so one of his opponents, he has two main opponents from what's called the kind of center-left camp, because the left wing in Israel is really very small, very diminished in recent years. But there are two centrist candidates who actually seem to be doing quite well these days because of their response to the judicial overhaul. And they're seen as kind of not heading the protest movement that is happening in Israel, but taking part in it, being more critical. One of them is Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition. But even more surprising is another candidate, Benny Gantz, this former military general, who didn't really do well in the latest election and was seen as kind of perhaps a sort of has-been, and he's suddenly rising in the polls, and that's an interesting outcome. So these are kind of two centrist candidates who are very critical of Netanyahu, but also not seen as kind of rocking the boat too much on the sort of the Israeli-Palestinian front, which is, this whole other front that we haven't even discussed, because the move over, sort of the threat to Israeli democracy has taken over the conversation so much.
Give me an example of how the threat to democracy has taken over the conversation.
Well, just the fact that, in Israel right now, there is no discussion about the Palestinians, about the two-state solution or what a solution would look like. There is barely any discussion over Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and what solution is in sight there. And really, the public conversation has been taken up by this question of the anti-democratic measures and the protest movement trying to stop trying to stop and to instill Israeli democracy and make it what it is, and sort of the real concern is that Israel proper, so Israel within the Green Line, what's called the Green Line, not including the West Bank, not including Gaza, all these years, there was a sense that, yes, there is a military occupation going on. Yes, there is a siege over Gaza, but Israel proper, within the Green Line, there are democratic norms, there are democratic institutions and safeguards, and real safeguards. And that is being threatened. And so right now, the whole conversation is about Israel proper and how to safeguard those democratic institutions.
Is there peace in the West Bank these days?
Is there? No, there is not. I mean, this is, that's the big sort of, maybe it's an elephant in the room. I don't know what to call it, because this entire conversation leaves out the real question about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what to do about the millions of Palestinians living without rights in the West Bank. And so there is this sort of dual conversation. And what people in the protest movements are saying is that first you have to, I think it was Yuval Noah Harari, the author this historian, author, Israeli, kind of prominent intellectual, who said that when your house is on fire, first you blow out the fire, right? So you have to stop the fire in your own house, and then you have to do something about your neighbors. And in this case, it's not only neighbors, but it's actual, it's people that Israel is occupying. So the idea is that, perhaps this fight over democracy, maybe it can be sort of united with the fight over the end of the occupation, and sort of branched out to include a kind of broader struggle in Israel. And it's too early to tell.
What's the current state of armed opposition from the Palestinians? Are they attacking? Are they planting bombs? Are they effective in any way? Are they killing Israelis?
Yeah, I mean, these are days there is increased violence on the Palestinian side. I mean, this is also, we're talking during Ramadan. There is real concern that, there's still terror threats as we're talking about, in Jerusalem and elsewhere. In part, this is incited by the far right, Netanyahu's far right ministers, kind of going after, they have these raids in Jenin and other refugee camps in the West Bank that are seen as being very inciting for the Palestinian population. And in part, it's a local, Hamas and other terrorist groups sort of fighting for, fighting among themselves, and also to hit Israelis. So yeah, these are really worrying days amid all the other tension that's going on.
Let's talk about press freedom in Israel. How has Netanyahu's actions and the back and forth affected how you do the job, and what threats you face personally?
So I think that's where Israel, despite all the talk about interventions and about control and Netanyahu's obsession, which I mentioned earlier, his obsession with the media, press in Israel is free. I don't feel personal threat, as critical as I may be, or as other journalists may be. There is no personal threat or sense of lack of security or anything like that. The real worry, I think, is that, I should mention there is an institution in Israel called the military censor. And for years, journalists in Israel had to work with the military censor. They could publish what they, every story they had, but the censor always got the last word if there was seen as being any threat to Israel's security or any kind of sensitive information. There was an attempt to keep it from leaking out. And any journalist operating in Israel who gets a license, as I do, from the government to operate here, we are beholden to those ethical, we are beholden to those standards, and some of the things we publish, if they're published in an Israeli outlet, will go through the military censor. That has been really that has taken a hit over the years because of the internet and international press. International press isn't beholden to the military censor. It can publish what it knows. And so Israeli journalists have always, in recent years, there is this dance of both, being free on the one hand, having this military censor over our heads on the other, but also because international press, covers everything and is very, is sort of free in that sense. Israeli journalists have come up with these formulations of saying, foreign media reports X and foreign reports say Y. And that's a kind of way of circumventing that. And so there are these kind of, maneuvers that are familiar to people, to journalists working in Israel, but it's more of a, it's not a threat so much as it is, sort of the framework in which we govern, and we know what it is. And I think the press here is very both kind of incisive and investigative, and really it holds the powerful to account in the way that it should. And so in that sense, it is heartening, despite everything that's going on. There's a press that fights back.
In a world where news organizations like the one you report for, the New York Times, are global, it's hard for me to see how censorship would work anyway. I assume the Times has a wide readership in Israel, as do many American newspapers and European newspapers. So how do they throw local reporters in jail, for example? Can they do that?
No, they don't. But they will call the editors and say that can't be published and this information can't be. I mean, and they can also, sort of disbar. They can take back your license and stop you from getting another one, so that you don't have access to, government events or whatever, any kind of going to the Knesset, for example. They can make life hard for you as a working journalist if you work around the military censor. But also, I shouldn't be implied that this censor is more than it is. It's just this kind of relic and this sort of, I guess, a combination of, being a democracy, but also having this, strong military and being in a kind of sort of, insecure environment where you're sort of having to operate in this sort of weird, it's this hybrid of both democratic institutions, but then these kind of military relics on the other hand.
You were speaking of Russian control and Russian efforts in here, and Mr. Putin, he's been distracted, of course, it's a mild word, I assume, by the war in Ukraine. Has that changed the level of Russian interference in Israel and in Syria?
Israel is now at a very strange crossroads where so far it has stayed away from making a clear statement in support of Ukraine, despite European countries, offering their support and even offering their, sort of financially and otherwise military support. Israel has been very quiet on this front and has received a lot of criticism, I think fairly so, for not speaking out against Putin. And in part, it has to do with what we talked about, this sort of sensitivity over Russia's influence in Syria and in the region at large. And this sense, I think, that Netanyahu is worried about its influence and worried that he could get on Putin's bad side, and not wanting that. But it's really, I mean, the Israel's sort of quiet over Ukraine is a real, morally, it's a sour point, I think, for many Israelis.
I would imagine it's a sour point for some Americans too, the American diplomats and the U.S. government, because what would, if Putin got out of sorts because he didn't think his alliance with Israel, his support in Israel was strong enough, what would he do? What sort of trouble could he make?
Well, he could have Iranian planes flying from Iran through Syria to Israel and attacking. He could have Assad in Syria, Syrian planes attacking, airstrikes. The sense right now is that Putin helps. I don't know if helps keep the quiet is the right word, but in a way, it could be an all-out war here, and right now it isn't, and so it's a very delicate situation.
Describe what an all-out war would look like.
No, I have no idea. I have no idea. I mean, this would be a future scenario of, but Israel's defense against Iran is its biggest concern right now, sort of internationally and diplomatically. And Syria is the front line, is what safeguards Israel from Iran. And so once, if there's a green line and warplanes can fly over Syria whenever they want, including from Iran, then that's a real worry.
I suppose. I wonder how effective, well, I don't know, and perhaps you don't know how effective the armed forces of those countries are. And those countries being Syria and Iran is what I'm thinking. But you don't want it to come to that, because no matter how effective or ineffective, planes dropping bombs are going to be killing Israelis, and I don't think anybody in Israel wants that. So,
right.
What do you think what will be the next development? Put on your predicting hat.
Domestically?
Well, domestically related to the issues we've been discussing.
We've been discussing. Yeah. So that's a real question. So right now, Netanyahu has suspended the legislation here. He has suspended this judicial overhaul because of the level of protests and the amount of backlash he is facing. But the real question is whether this is just a temporary freeze and a kind of way to, quiet down the protests, make people think that the threat is over and that the reform isn't going to pass, and then suddenly ramming it through the next parliament, which is starting now. So there's a new parliament term that's now beginning, and no one knows if these laws will be taken up again during this parliament seat, or whether Netanyahu will whether a suspension is really a suspension and a freeze, and that he understood that that these laws will just not pass in the Israeli climate, and that the public will not abide by this. I don't know. I don't know how serious to take this suspension. And it could be, the protests right now are ongoing in Israel. Every Saturday, Israelis are taking to the streets again and again, because despite the suspension in the legislation, there's a sense that, it's not, the quiet is only temporary, and that these measures could still be passed at any time. And so the protests are still happening. There's a sense that it's an ongoing crisis, and it's hard to predict what will happen.
Is it conceivable that there would be a Netanyahu dictatorship, suspending all other functions of government and just taking it over? Is that conceivable?
I think it's conceivable, not as it's not that one day he will go on the airwaves and say, listen, citizens of Israel, this is now no longer a democracy, et cetera, et cetera. It won't be as blunt as that. But I think by weakening the Supreme Court, by in effect taking charge over all three branches of government in Israel, this could be a Netanyahu dictatorship. I mean, this could in effect amount to an illiberal democracy, from the likes we see in Poland and Hungary, for example. And so, is Orban in Hungary a dictator? Many people will say so. Once you get rid of the democratic elements and the institutions, or you keep them, but you sort of control them and you make them very weak and sort of irrelevant, then in effect, I think we're dealing with a dictatorship. Or we could.
Let's talk about the public in Israel. I'm not really clear on, for example, the demographic groups in it. What percentage is younger? What percentage is older? Where is Netanyahu's support speaking among the citizens of Israel demographically?
So demographically, the trends right now are looking, more and more positive and favorable to Netanyahu. It's not even Netanyahu's camp, but it's more his coalition. So ultra-Orthodox elements in Israel, those trends are really demographically, there's a real boom in ultra-Orthodox society. And the sense is that it will only increase. So those elements will only grow. Society is getting younger, but also much more ultra-Orthodox and religious. Also, the Arab society is growing too, but not to the extent of the ultra-Orthodox. And so in a few years, in 20, 30, 40 years, the ultra-Orthodox will really become a kind of majority even in Israel, some predict. And that's a huge change in the sort of how to perceive of this country. But I should also say that the demographics of the protest movement that is now ongoing, this grassroots protest movement against these government measures, that's also demographically quite interesting because it's young people and old people, ethnically mixed, politically mixed. So there is a sense of perhaps, if Israel goes through a political realignment where it's no longer just a question of right wing versus left wing, but really a kind of, civil democratic society that promotes democracy and promotes civil rights, as opposed to an illiberal society, messianic elements, very religious elements that want to do away with liberal democracy. If that becomes a realignment, then actually the demographics are also on the protest, on the sort of the civil camp. Those are looking favorable too. So it's kind of hard. It's a question of how you slice it. But that's how it is.
Does this keep you up at night thinking about it? Are you worried about something in particular?
No, I am, and I have young children, and I'm bringing them up here in this country, and it's a country I love. But I think that many, my friends and I, when we talk about it, we just don't know where it's going, and my son is in the first grade, and there's actually a battle going on over the curriculum, what he will learn. I mean, this is no longer, this isn't just sort of headlines or something in the newspapers and in the news, but will he only learn, things like the Bible, or that democracy only belongs to a majority of people? Or will he learn that that democracy is also, safeguarding minority rights and civil rights? And, what will the curriculum look like in Israel for future students? What will my children sort of grow up into in this country? Will it be a democracy or not? That really keeps me up at night. And I know it keeps my friends up at night, and many people here.
Would you conceivably, do you have an escape route?
I think, I had an escape route. I lived in New York for a decade, and I moved back to Israel because it is home for me. And so, it feels very privileged. I was talking to some friends, some of us who have a second passport and those who don't. It feels like the kind of escape of the entitled, because so many people in Israel don't have that option. They're here, and so I don't hope to use an escape route just yet. I hope that we're able to still live here and to report and cover this place that I love so much, that it will remain a democracy, and we'll be able to have a conversation about other things too, like the occupation, and what happens with the Palestinians. There are other questions to be asked, but we're not even able to sort of deal with them right now because of this threat.
Still, that's about as close to an upbeat ending, I think, as we're going to get in this discussion. But I wanted to say, we have this traditional last question for our guests. What does press freedom mean to you? We've been talking about that all the way through the hour, though. So in a general sense, not just related to Israel, is there anything you wish to add to what you've said?
What does press freedom mean to me? I think I really think it is the hallmark of democracy. We were talking about, you know, what is democracy and sort of safeguarding rights and the courts, but a free press is such a huge part of that, and free and vibrant press that isn't interfered with. You know, it's such a major part of a functioning and vibrant democracy. And, you know, and I think Israel used to be that, is that, but will it remain that? That's the big question.
I should have asked you this earlier. What do Israelis make of Donald Trump?
Well, it's funny that we mentioned Trump now, when, you know, we were talking about Netanyahu this whole hour, but there are a lot of similarities, including actually both Netanyahu and Trump's relation to the press, because, you know, interestingly, they both gained their popularity from, you know, they owe much of their popularity to the press that kind of build them up. You know, the press built up Donald Trump, and they also built up Netanyahu, you know, back in the 80s when he was this ambassador to the UN, kind of this dashing figure, and interviewers loved him, and he loved the TV circuit. And so that was a big part of his appeal and Trump's appeal. And then this kind of change, you know, Netanyahu speaks the Trump language. He's railing against the witch hunt, and railing against the media, and railing against journalists and the elites and what they're doing to him. And so it's this dual, you know, they both kind of learn from the same playbook.
I will tell you that when I was a White House correspondent, one of the stories that I covered was Bill Clinton and Mr. Arafat and the Prime Minister shaking hands on the South Lawn. Remember, with Bill Clinton putting his posed picture like that.
The Oslo Peace Accord.
It was a thrilling day for, you know, people, someone like myself who just had a passing knowledge of details then and now, I might add. But it was also a sense of optimism at that time, which I suspect was stronger in the United States than it was in Israel. But is there any kind of sense of optimism there now in Israel?
Not on this level. There will not be a sort of symbolic moment again of this kind of, you know, a peace deal and two sides shaking hands, and, you know, this sense that something is happening. But I think optimism is a sort of fudgy word, but there is this sense that there could be, you know, brokered by the United States, brokered by outside countries, there could be something similar to a compromise or to a peace deal that will take a different form. But it's that's a sense of optimism, I think, for the sort of liberal camp that you're talking about.
Well, for all of our sake, I hope it works out better than that. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Ruth. A terrific discussion.
Thank you, Steve.
Ruth Margalit, a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and I hope you'll be looking at the magazine for her byline in the future, contributing to this program today from Tel Aviv. Now, bit of business here. Please sign up for the SPJ International Community newsletter and stop by the website on a regular basis to learn about future IC talks. For Ruth Margalit and for Dan Kubisky, I'm Steve Taylor. Thanks for watching.
Is how, as a journalist in Israel, do you cover religious extremism, and what role does it play in inflaming political discourse?
It's a good question. You know, religious extremism is on the rise here, and the way to cover it. So I recently covered for the New Yorker. I wrote a profile of a far-right, ultra-nationalist minister who kind of represents this religious extremism, also political extremism, any kind of extremism. And in terms of covering that, it's, you know, it's very hard to gain access because it's, you know, some of these groups do not want to talk. We're talking about the ultra-Orthodox. There's also, you know, sometimes if you're a female journalist, there are, you know, limitations around that. So there, you know, getting access is difficult. But because these groups are also part of the government and part of the ruling coalition, there is an openness, there is an understanding that they have to be a bit more transparent. So I was able to gain a lot of interviews and a lot of insight from sort of the people around this minister and the kind of the aides, the people who, that go back to, childhood and sort of do this kind of investigative work around, sort of around him and his cohort. But really, I mean, covering religious extremism, like any kind of subset or any group, any closed group, it's a really hard thing to crack. It's the same with sort of military units, secret intelligence units. And so you kind of treat it with that, sort of with that framework that you have to, you gain leads and you start cracking it. And slowly, once, and as with any closed group, once you have some members there who are willing to talk, then you find out that actually more people want to talk as well.
One other thing, I'm sorry, you mentioned licenses for journalists.
Yeah,
How
called
does that process work?
Well, it's called a GPO card. So that's a government press. It's released by the government press office, and I apply for it yearly. I think I can't remember when mine expires. But every journalist working in Israel gets this from the government, including foreign correspondents, and that's their access card to everything that's going on. And this GPO, for foreign correspondents, it's pretty straightforward. They apply, they get it. But for freelance journalists, for journalists working in Israel, you have to show that you know what the GPO rules are, and you kind of abide by those standards.
Okay.
That situation is, we have government issued press cards in this country too, but we don't have to sign any papers about what we're going to say. So, but I could not get into the White House on a daily basis without that card. Right. And the same is true covering Congress or the Supreme Court.
Right. And then it's also not, it's not that we have to sign, it's not a legal contract, but the understanding is that, as we talked about, things like the military censor, all these institutions that you have to understand what these are and, play by the rules there, because otherwise, you could be out of the card.